All right, hello everybody, and welcome back to another video about the goal of full employment. This is part two. If you haven't watched part one already and you're in my class, what are you doing? Go back and watch that. If you've just found this through YouTube or whatever, we're going to be looking at trends in aggregate demand and aggregate supply side factors and how they impact the achievement of full employment. We're also going to talk about kind of trends that have been occurring in recent times with full employment in terms of the unemployment rate, job vacancies, as well as the participation rate. So we're going to start off by looking at recent trends in unemployment in Australia. So on average over the past year, unemployment has been on the rise in Australia from 4.8% in 2019 and it's risen up to 5.3% in March 2020. More recently in April, it was measured at 5.1%. But as you probably know, based on this global pandemic, there have been predictions through various statistical agencies predicting that unemployment will go up over 10% and it could go up as high as 15%, depending on how effective these JobKeeper payments and job seeker payments that the government are offering end up being. So as with everything, when we look at recent trends, most often you're going to be given a graph that's going to look fairly similar to this, and you're going to be asked to look at recent times. Recent in economics means the last 2 years. So as always, just make sure that you draw a line and ignore everything before the last 2 years. That is meaningless to you. You care about the last 2 years. So over the last 2 years, you would argue that unemployment has fallen slightly, but it is predicted to rise based on the current economic climate. If we look at the participation rate has actually been changing favorably since 2018. Even though it is fairly small, like there's been a 0.5% increase in the participation rate being how many people are either employed or are actively looking for work. So that's 2/3 of the population looking for either working or actively looking for work, which is fairly positive. That means that people are wanting to work and earn an income in Australia. That is very positive for the achievement of other goals like economic growth, because it means there is labour available to try and help produce those goods and services if needed. Once again, in this crazy COVID-19 situation, that number could drop pretty significantly soon as people stop looking for work because there is not going to be as much work available. That participation rate could drop over the next couple of months. Then we have trends in job vacancies. So hopefully you remember job vacancies are a fairly big indicator of future levels of economic growth and future levels of employment. It's kind of a strange thing to think about because you think about if there are a large number of job vacancies, the initial instinct is to think that, well, if they're advertising all these jobs, there's no one to fulfill them, therefore things are bad. But if they're advertising that they need labor, it means they want to produce more. And this is very positive for unemployment. It's also very positive for economic growth. But for full employment, if there is increasing job vacancies, that's likely that then the unemployment rate will fall because people will take those jobs and therefore become employed. As you can hopefully see, over the last 2 years, job vacancies have been rising, but then they have started to fall. And even more recently, that number is going to plummet as there are nowhere near as many job vacancies being advertised now. So that's going to be important to know that when there are not many job vacancies available, that is going to be negative for achieving the goal of full employment. So recent influences on Australia's employment and unemployment rates. So we're going to break it down into two parts, as we always do. We're going to look at the aggregate demand side factors first that have affected cyclical unemployment, and then we're going to look at the aggregate supply side factors that have influenced rates of natural unemployment, specifically structural. That's going to be massive at the moment. So changes in domestic demand side factors. Firstly, there is much lower consumer confidence. You could probably predict why. Consumer confidence being all about how confident consumers feel about their future incomes and employment. People aren't feeling that confident about their future incomes and employment at the moment. I am, because I'm a teacher. I've got a pretty good deal at the moment that I'm going to continue being employed regardless of what goes on in the world, but people in non-essential industries have very low confidence at the moment. So people are not as likely to spend as they were before. And this has meant that aggregate demand is going to fall significantly, and a lot of businesses, even before there were structural changes because of government intervention, etc., there has been a lot of people were laid off in the lead up to that because businesses saw that there wasn't going to be as much spending, therefore they didn't need as many workers on hand. So that's a cyclical change. As we start going into a contraction in the economy, they start laying off more workers, and that is a cyclical form of unemployment. Weaker business confidence, businesses really wouldn't be that confident at the moment. A good example for this, so my local cafe, I really like them in general, but I was talking to the owner the other day, and because they're not allowed to have people dine in and they're only takeaway now, even though they've adapted, they've been doing ordering through an app, their sales are down 70% solely because they're only doing takeaway. And that's a significant change for a business. And it's meant that they've had to minimize the amount of labor they have on hand, minimize the amount of stock they're bringing in, and they're not going to be fully confident about their future. They're not going to want to invest and expand. They're not going to want to employ more people. And this is negative for the achievement of full employment. There's also been a drop in the household savings ratio over the past few years. What this means is households aren't saving as much. In Australia, we've got an issue with what's called the household indebtedness ratio, which is the amount of debt that households have compared to what they're earning. We have incredible amounts of debt in Australia, and especially with record low interest rates at the moment. In the future, if interest rates begin to increase, there are a lot of Australians that may struggle to then get by. And so if there's been a drop in the household savings ratio over the past few years, that's going to lead to more spending, because if people aren't saving, they are spending that money, and that's actually positive for employment overall. There's been a reduced growth in disposable income. People's money isn't spreading as far as it used to. Most essential services that we pay for have become far more expensive compared to the increase in income that we've been earning, and therefore the disposable income doesn't actually spread as far, and they're less likely to spend on non-essential items like luxuries, etc., and therefore there's going to be less employment in those industries. There's been slower growth in the population. That's a pretty simple one. If there's a higher population, there's going to be more people demanding goods and services, therefore we need more people to fulfill the jobs that create those goods and services, therefore those jobs will be created, there's going to be an expansion in economic activity, and therefore more people employed, more likely to achieve the goal of full employment. And there is also a lot of change at the moment in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which we've kind of touched on a lot along the way here. There's also been a lot of changes in the overseas demand side factors. So changes in the rate of economic growth amongst our trading partners. I think I read this morning that there's been a 5.2%, I'm probably making that number up now, drop in the global economy. So all across the world, there has been a significant decrease in the overall level of economic growth and activity. That's going to change the level of employment in Australia, because any of our exporting industries are going to have to lay off workers to protect themselves during this time where trade is lower. Changes in the terms of trade can affect the overall level of full employment. So if the terms of trade are high, that's favorable for our exports, which means that exporting businesses are going to employ more people, and that helps us achieve full employment. Changes in the exchange rate for the Australian dollar. Interesting, at the moment the Australian dollar is at the lowest it has ever been, and that's actually a positive thing. So that's really positive for our exports. That means that our exports are more favorable and enticing to our trading partners, which means that there is a good chance that people would then be employed in those exporting industries, and there would be more jobs available there. And then lastly, obviously, the effects of the pandemic affecting trade and the future effects it can have on trade. There's going to be a bigger and bigger push to keep a lot of jobs in Australia, to make sure we have a sustainable level of supply in Australia after all of this goes down. There's been a lot of argument I've been reading a lot of news articles, a sad amount of news articles, about the different foods that we're likely to run out of the longer that this pandemic goes on for. And there was this big long argument about the fact that we're going to run out of rice because we get the majority of our rice from overseas, which makes sense because the reason we get the majority of our rice from overseas is because Australia doesn't have a competitive advantage at growing rice. But there's an argument that after all this is over, in case something of this nature happens again in the future, we should invest in making sure we produce goods and services within our own borders so that we have more employment there and we have a sustainable level of goods and services if things were to ever happen on this global pandemic scale again. Then if we look at changes in supply side factors, so some general recent causes of structural unemployment in Australia, so things like the use of new technology. So we love replacing, from a business point of view, we love replacing workers with technology. I always use the example of self-serve checkouts and the example like at McDonald's, how you go up to the kiosk and you don't have to talk to another human being. You just go to that kiosk, order what you want, and then they make it and you pick it up. Even things like ordering apps, so your Uber Eats, Deliveroo, Menu Log, all those kind of things, that new technology can actually cause structural unemployment because it can make the people whose job used to be taking the orders redundant and they're no longer needed. So they become structurally unemployed because of that. Other new technologies, such as anytime in manufacturing, human beings are replaced with robots. If you do business management in AOS2, you'll look at manufacturing and how in automotive manufacturing, there has been a big push where they used to have production lines where humans put all the parts into cars, whereas now it's mostly robotic arms that do it. And that use of new technology replaces workers with that technology and they become structurally unemployed because the structure of the business has changed. One big issue in Australia at the moment is a mismatch in skills amongst the unemployed people. So a lot of people who are unemployed in Australia do not have the skills they need to get the jobs that are available. And so even though they have skills, they can't get a job because the skills they have don't match up with the jobs that are available. There's actually been a push to try and fix this in New South Wales recently, where the New South Wales government, I believe some other governments have actually the New South Wales government has made a whole bunch of TAFE courses free for the next 6 months so people can upskill themselves. And also in some parts of Australia, they've put a 74% discount on university degrees and TAFE courses for industries where we have skill shortages. So I know nursing degrees were becoming heavily discounted because we need more healthcare workers, which is a really good way to incentivize the unemployed people to get the skills they need to become employed, either during this pandemic or after this pandemic is over. Because if your skills don't match the jobs available, well then you can't get the jobs available and you're going to remain being unemployed. There's also been business closures due to relocation due to high costs, poor profits, and lack of international competitiveness. So our biggest issue in Australia is that we don't produce a lot of things in Australia because our minimum wage is one of the highest in the world. This leads a lot of manufacturing and a lot of business to occur overseas. There's a lot of offshoring that occurs in Australia just because our minimum wage is so high. And we also tend to have pretty poor labour productivity compared to some parts of the world. There have also been other aggregate supply side policies attempting to change the operation of the labour market. So they've tried to have changes to unfair dismissal laws because it's really hard to fire ineffective workers in Australia. And also there have been some changes to penalty rates to try and make it cheaper for businesses to operate on public holidays and weekends, which is trying to make businesses more efficient and more able to operate during those times so they do not have to lay off workers. There's also been government trade liberalisation, which is about making freer trade, which often means that local businesses end up closing down because they can't compete with international businesses that are more competitive and can produce at a lower cost. Kind of goes back to the example I made earlier that we don't grow rice in Australia. We don't because parts of Asia grow rice far more efficiently than we do, so there is no point in us producing it ourselves. And lastly, some recent causes of frictional unemployment. So changes in the building trade in some areas of rural industry. Basically, there's been a lot of changes in those industries recently, like farms are closing down or changing what they're doing, and that's led to people losing their jobs, and just frictional unemployment being the time between losing their job and starting their next job. It just causes that frictional unemployment while they wait to start their next job. Recent causes of hardcore unemployment have formed in Australia. There's a lot of people who are too comfortable on welfare, which creates what's called the welfare trap, where some people choose not to work and live off welfare. My most frustrating personal experience of this is I remember when I used to work in a bottle shop, and you'd be surprised to hear this, but when you work in the bottle shop, a lot of people who are on welfare, for some reason, also drink a lot. That's not everyone, but the specific subset of like customers that we had, a lot of them were also on welfare. And there was this one guy I remember who came in one day and bought a long neck of beer and bought it and instantly started drinking it and said, I'm drinking this because then when I go to my job interview at Centrelink, I won't get it and I can continue getting welfare because I just want to live off welfare for the rest of my life. And I don't think I've ever been as angry at a stranger as I was in that moment, because him being comfortable living off welfare for the rest of his life while I was working at my job where I was paying tax, which was then paying for his welfare, was so ironic and so painful for me to hear. This is a big thing. Welfare in Australia, although they've put more and more things in to try and make it more difficult for people to stay on welfare if they're not seeking employment, especially in the pandemic at the moment, they've increased welfare payments, like the job seeker payments, $550 a fortnight now, or $565 to be exact. And they've also reduced some of the job seeking requirements because there aren't as many jobs available. Hoping that over time they'll implement more and more education and training that needs to be done while you're on welfare to try and remove that mismatch of skills, so then these people can go from being hardcore unemployed to just being employed in areas that we need them. All right, and that is all for today's PowerPoint on aggregate demand, aggregate supply side trends in unemployment over recent years. If you have any questions about this at all, feel free to contact me. Thank you for watching this video. Feel free to watch any of my other videos about full employment, how it's measured and limitations, or the same things all about inflation. You can find them either here or on my YouTube channel. Thank you for listening. Have a good day, and I will talk to you next time.